Week 17 fantasy football championships are a lot like pissing into the wind. You may not have a choice at the time, you just got to take care of some business. That's what we're about today, talking starts and sits, wide receivers, and running backs. Week 17. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Welcome to Week 17 Fantasy Football, the last possible week for Fantasy Football. And I get it, not a lot of you guys out there play in Week 17, so throw a brother a favor and hit the like button for me because views probably aren't going to be that great, but we got you covered. We talk about it all season long. We're not just here, for the people who play championships in Week 16. It doesn't matter when you play. We're here for everybody to try to help people win fantasy championships. So here we are, Week 17, and it's going to be a tough one to figure out. Some of these matchups, some of these start decisions are really difficult because there's a lot of players that may not see a full workload here this week. That's one of the problems you run into playing in Week 17, but we're going to chase some volume and some opportunities, some key matchups this week that could carry you to a fantasy football championship. However, before we get into Week 17, like usual, let's see how we did at both the running back and wide receiver position for Week 16. A great week in Week 17 for the running back position. We had a total of 50 running backs that we gave a start or sit designation to that finished their games this past week. Out of those 50, 40 of them were correct calls for an accuracy percentage of 80% there for the week. Some of our biggest hits: Devontae Freeman, love the matchup. Dude performed one of his best games of the year last week. Melvin Gordon came out hot. Phillip Lindsay, somebody that I really liked last week. A lot of people down on Phillip Lindsay. He had himself a huge game. Marlon Mack had a great game. And Adrian Peterson called him all week, saying he was one of these safer flex options. He returned on his investment there also. Some of the biggest misses, Kenyon Drake is apparently the reincarnate of Barry Sanders at this point because the guy is playing out of his mind. Ronald Jones mentioned in the video that he had a chance if they could commit some more to him in the passing game. He had a solid day. Rex Burkhead, more touchdown dependent, not really getting the volume. He was a miss. Austin Eckler wasn't quite as involved as Melvin Gordon this past week. Expected more touches going the way of Eckler. Didn't get it. He was a miss. And then Joe Mixon. He was kind of a slam dunk play early in the week, but then he ended up with flu-like symptoms, and it really limited his upside despite the great matchup going up against the Miami Dolphins. But what about the wide receiver position? A very solid week for the wide receiver position. Also had a total of 60 wide receivers with a start or sit designation that finished their games this past week. Out of those 60, 38 were correct calls for an accuracy percentage of 63%. Some of our biggest hits: Tyler Boyd, had him listed as a start last week. Dude was the wide receiver 1 in some scoring formats. Sterling Shepard had himself a solid week. Robert Woods continued to catch balls. He was a start for us also. Kenny Galladay, Hotel, Motel, Galladay Inn, was playing well last week. Had him as a start. He was a hit. Also, Deebo Samuel. A lot of questions going back and forth of who do we trust in that wide receiver group in San Francisco. I had Deebo Samuel as a start, Emmanuel Sanders as a sit last week. That ended up working out. Deebo Samuel there, one of the hits that we had. Some of the biggest misses: Cole Beasley. Wasn't quite expecting that type of volume. The big play went to John Brown, kind of like we had planned, but Cole Beasley's volume wasn't quite as expected. Justin Watson, expected a little bit more going towards Brashad Perryman, but Justin Watson, he was more than serviceable last week. Larry Fitzgerald found the end zone. Kind of hard to count on that because he hasn't done it a whole lot this year, but he was a miss. How about the duo there of Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf? Shut down by the Arizona defense. That is not expected. Absolutely killed a lot of people Week 16. Along with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, both those guys underperformed in Week 16 and were both misses for us also. But now we're heading into Week 17, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. We're trying to chase volume this week. There's a lot of unknowns heading into Week 17, so we have to chase what we do know and chase the volume. Wherever the volume is, that's where the potential fantasy points are, and that's what we're going to look for here today. So without taking up any more time, let's head into Week 17 starts and sits for running backs and wide receivers. All right, no Thursday Night Football, no Monday Night Football, so the first game up on Sunday is going to be the Cleveland Browns and Cincinnati Bengals. Now, Cincinnati, they've basically locked themselves into that number 1 pick in the upcoming NFL draft. We all expect it to be Joe Burrow, but let's find out how that plays out. Now, it would not surprise me to see very little defense in this game. Both teams allow 20-plus fantasy points to opposing running backs and wide receivers. Now, we're still a couple days away from the game, but there is a very, very good chance that not only will the field conditions be wet, but it could be raining at the time of the game. If that's the case, I expect a heavy dose of the run game on both sides. Nick Chubb, the NFL rushing leader, you're obviously going to be starting him. Kareem Hunt saw his fewest touches of the season this past week with only 7 touches in Week 16, kind of surprising to a lot of people. I mean, Hunt, though, he remains a solid flex play, especially in PPR formats if you have him, especially this week. Now, for Joe Mixon, he dealt with the flu last week. A lot of people expected big numbers, myself included, going up against the Miami Dolphins. He was not 100%. He was, on the injury report late in the week, dealt with those flu-like symptoms to start the game, and never really, got going in that game. That was a big disappointment. However, with this matchup, going right back in to the start column. Now, what about for the wide receivers? For Cincinnati, Tyler Boyd exploded last week. 9 catches, 128 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But John Ross also turned in a pretty solid stat line himself. 13 targets for John Ross, 6 receptions for 84 yards, no touchdowns, and that's always kind of what limits the ceiling of John Ross. Now, we already kind of know what to expect from Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham, a sputtering offense at times in Cleveland. We already mentioned the possibility of rain in this game. In my opinion, I'm only willing to risk it on the 2 safer options from each team, Jarvis Landry and Tyler Boyd. Odell Beckham, more boom or bust, more hit or miss, similar to John Ross. If the weather conditions are bad and they're more reliant on the running game, don't know if I'm willing to risk it with Beckham or Ross here in Week 17. If you have no better options, they're touchdown dependent, they're big play dependent, but that option is always there. What about the Dolphins and Patriots now? Now, New England, they still need to win this game. They're trying to fight to be that number 2 seed and get that first round bye in the NFL playoffs. But if you don't think that Brian Flores, who came from New England, and the Miami Dolphins aren't trying to play spoiler, you are severely mistaken, because they really want to. Now, can they pull it off? Can they do it? Probably not. It's probably not going to happen, but we know that New England's going to try to win this game on the ground and on the defensive side of the football. I'm not going to trust any running backs of the Miami Dolphins in this game, going up against what is still the top-ranked run defense there in the New England Patriots in New England in a must-win game. Not worth the risk, in my opinion. But what about New England? Sony Michel, James White. I may take a chance on both of these guys here this week. Now, last time these teams met, Sony Michel had 21 carries, 83 yards, and a touchdown. But the problem has really been James White as of late. Also, he only has 13 total touches in his last 2 games combined. That is absolutely crazy usage for James White. They need to get the guy this ball more often in New England to really make more plays. We know Julian Edelman is not 100%. However, last game, he looked healthy enough, and they're going to need him in a must-win game this week. You better believe he's probably going to be on the field once again. I will not be surprised if another one of the random wide receivers this week of the New England Patriots scores a touchdown, whether it's Mohamed Sanu or N'Keal Harry, whoever it may be. It would not surprise me, but trying to pinpoint who that may be is next to impossible. If you're in a fantasy championship this week, Julian Edelman going to be the safest bet. Sony Michel, I mentioned at the beginning there that I expect this to be a ground and pound defensive type game for the New England Patriots. Over the past couple games, the usage has been there for Sony Michel. Is it pretty? No. But like I said, we're chasing volume, and as of right now, he's getting it, and he's shown that he can produce against this team in the past. It's the Dolphins. Yes, I'm going to start Sony Michel if need be this week. Now, what about on the Dolphins side for the pass-catching wide receivers? What about Devontae Parker? Fantasy Bigfoot. There's been sightings for weeks here in fantasy football. What do we do this week, though? He'll more than likely be matched up against Stephon Gilmore, and these 2 teams faced back in week 2 when Devontae Parker was shut out. But this is a different Devontae Parker this week than there was that week way back in the beginning of the season. The guy has totally broken out and exploded. A lot of it because of Ryan Fitzmagic. Just likes to throw the ball all over the place and play gunslinger there under center. I will not sit Devontae Parker. However, you need to temper expectations. He's going to be touchdown dependent. He's more of a low-end wide receiver 2 than a low-end wide receiver 1 that we've seen from him here the past few weeks. I'll still start him. Just had to take some caution there that he may not produce hopefully what you need for your fantasy championship. Bears and Vikings, and am I one of the only people out there that really don't care for this matchup? At least from a fantasy perspective anyway. I mean, neither one of these teams are really playing for anything. Minnesota, they're already locked into their playoff spot, and they really can't gain anything by winning this game here. Is there a chance that they rest their studs? Yeah, there's a very good chance that that happens. What about on the Bears side? David Montgomery in the running game has been basically non-existent. He is blown for most of the year. Boy, am I glad we did not push him as the second coming here in the offseason. What about Tariq Cohen? He hasn't had at least 10 touches in a game in over a month. I mean, we know Dalvin Cook isn't playing for the Minnesota Vikings. That saves us somewhat of a headache. But do we really want to trust the experiment of Mike Boone and Alexander Madison this week? Look what happened to that run game last week without Dalvin Cook. Okay, what about the wide receiver side? Adam Thielen, 0 receptions on 4 targets last week. Stephon Diggs, I mean, he's very touchdown dependent at this point. He has only had one 100-yard receiving game since week 9. Anthony Miller came into last week's game on fire. He had 1 reception. Maybe the safest bet of anybody from the wide receiver position is Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. He's had at least 10 targets, 4 out of his last 5 games. Remember, we're chasing volume. Minnesota, they allow 23 fantasy points per game, so I'll risk it with Allen Robinson. Heck, I'll even risk it with Anthony Miller over Adam Thielen here this week. The volume could be there if Minnesota rests some starters. It could be a great opportunity for some garbage points for the Chicago Bears. For Minnesota, I'll take a risk on Stephon Diggs only if I have no better options. Like I said, a real possibility that their starters could miss some time. If that means that Diggs misses, the second half of the game, maybe they bench Kirk Cousins and rest him. There's a lot of risk involved that I would prefer to stay away from Stephon Diggs. If you have no better option, he's worth a flex play at best. Just keep your fingers crossed. Chargers and Chiefs now, and Kansas City really, really wants and needs this win. They want to secure that first round bye in the NFL playoffs. But this is a game full of pass-catching weapons that could be dominated by the running games on both sides. Both defenses allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Damian Williams seems to be back to 100% health. Last week, 16 carries, 65 yards, 3 receptions for 27 yards, and found the end zone. It's simple. The Kansas City offense is really easy to figure out once you know who the guy is. If there's an offensive running back there that's touching the ball 15 times a game, he's a start. That's just the way it is. The upside is going to be there. The biggest problem all season with the running game in Kansas City was the consistency and who's getting the touches. If you get somebody like Damian Williams going out there getting 15 to 20 touches, it makes him a start here in Week 17. What about on the Chargers side? Melvin Gordon, Austin Eckler. At worst, on a weekly basis, they're always weekly flex plays. Melvin Gordon, he's had at least 10 fantasy points, 7 out of his 8 last games, and has 8 touchdowns over his last 11. Eckler, I mean, heck, right now he's on the verge of pushing for 90 receptions, 1,500 total yards. Both of these guys, despite, struggling games at times, they both need to be in your starting lineup on a weekly basis. As for the wide receiver side of things, Tyreek Hill is going to be in your lineup. Now, despite having 5 straight games with less than 73 receiving yards, and he only has 1 game with a touchdown since week 11, he can absolutely go out there and change the course of your fantasy matchup all by himself. Regardless of matchup, you're starting Tyreek Hill. For the Chargers, I mean, this is a great secondary for the Kansas City Chiefs. Right now, they are number 3, allowing only 16 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. The volume, it's still going towards Keenan Allen. And what are we doing? That's right, we're chasing the volume. He's had at least 10 targets in 6 out of his last 9 games. In my opinion, Mike Williams, just a little bit more of a risk. Big play, touchdown-dependent type of risk. He only has 5 games with 5+ receptions 3 times all year long. Just not consistent volume there for Mike Williams. And if I had to risk it with one of them, it's going to be Keenan Allen instead of having to rely on the big play of Mike Williams. Jets and Bills, and who else out there with me wishes that Buffalo would just come out and go all medieval on the Jets? I mean, especially after that stupid comment of head coach Adam Gase of the Jets, where he came out and said basically he doesn't care about the fan base. He's rich as... I mean, what? Who comes out and says something like that after a horrible season? But the Bills, they're not really in must-win territory. Now, I can see Buffalo coming out quickly, getting a lead early, kind of taking their foot off the pedal a little bit and relying more on the run game's second half. The Jets, they have a top 10 defense against opposing running backs, but they're 7th worst against opposing wide receivers. That's why I expect Buffalo to come out quickly early. Maybe we see a lot more John Brown and Cole Beasley first half of the game. Second half, a little bit more Devin Singletary and even Frank Gore this week, trying to make sure these guys are well rested going into the playoffs. It's kind of why I'm off the running game of the Buffalo Bills this week. Solid defense on that side for the Jets, and maybe we see a little bit more of a 50-50 split this week heading into the playoffs, kind of leaving that volume up as a big unknown. So I'm kind of trying to avoid them if at all possible in Buffalo. Now, for the Jets, Buffalo is number 2 against opposing wide receivers. They're one of the best teams in the league on that side of the field. And what happens with Tre'Davious White? Does he shadow Robbie Anderson? I mean, Jamison Crowder, he's found some room as of late. He's had at least 7 targets, 5 out of his 6 last games. I mean, there's a chance there that these guys could really be involved in some garbage time numbers. Think about it. If Buffalo can come out quick and get a lead, we may have to see, Sam Darnold and the Jets throw all 4 quarters. Maybe a few garbage plays there, end of the game, really help you in your fantasy lineup. But more than anything, these guys are all flex plays at best. Now, Buffalo does allow 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and Le'Veon Bell has had at least 10 fantasy points in 6 out of his last 7 games. He's had at least 20 touches over the past 2 weeks, and those are his 2 highest rushing totals of the season. I expect that to be the same once again this week. A heavy dose of Le'Veon Bell and a whole lot of garbage time for the Jets. Packers and Lions in Green Bay, they still have something to play for. And if players are out there playing for something, that only boosts their upside here in fantasy football week 17. Not that you needed an excuse to start Aaron Jones or Devontae Adams. I mean, right now, the Lions allow over 23 fantasy points per game to running backs and over 26 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. You're going to start both of these guys again this week. They helped a lot of people win championships in week 16. Would not surprise me to see the same thing happen in week 17. Now for Detroit, I see kind of a split once again of Kerryon Johnson and maybe Bo Scarborough in that backfield, but I don't expect to see a whole lot of running from the Detroit Lions. I expect Green Bay to come out to a lead, and the Detroit Lions being forced to throw the ball all 4 quarters. It's kind of why I'll still start Kenny Galladay. He's had 27 targets over his last 3 weeks, touchdowns in 3 of his last 4, and he's done it against some pretty difficult competition at times. Chris Harris, Prince Amukamara, Xavier Rhodes, who's not exactly what he used to be, but still, he's not out there just, pushing around people that nobody's ever heard of. They're going to have to throw the ball in Detroit to have any chance this week. And if nothing else, they'll just pad some stats and help Kenny Galladay further his great season that he's had here. Love the touchdown upside. Love the potential volume. Give me Kenny Galladay for the Lions, but that's about it. Saints and Panthers now, and we're in the NFC where the 12-3 New Orleans Saints are still playing for a win here in Week 17, but they get a great matchup going up against the Carolina Panthers. Carolina, they allow 28.4 fantasy points per game on the ground to running backs and almost 23 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, there's a chance of rain in this game, so pay attention to that going into the weekend. But you never sit Michael Thomas, and you never should really sit Alvin Kamara either. Yeah, he's been a disappointment, but he's shown here recently why you keep him in your starting lineup. In a great matchup, both of those guys staying in the start column. Also, Christian McCaffrey, I don't care about the matchup. I don't care about how difficult the run defense is in the New Orleans Saints. You just start Christian McCaffrey. The guy put up like 30 on him the last time they played. But what about the wide receiver position here for the Carolina Panthers? You have DJ Moore. He's in the concussion protocol. Does he clear? If he doesn't, then all of a sudden Curtis Samuel becomes the lead wide receiver. Maybe he sees more Marshawn Lattimore. I haven't even touched the quarterback situation there with Will Grier. I mean, between that and the weather and the matchup here going up against the Saints, I would prefer to avoid everybody not named Christian McCaffrey here this week. Falcons and Bucks now, and 2 teams playing for absolutely nothing here but stats here at the end of the season. If you have Julio Jones, congratulations. He has a matchup with one of the worst secondaries in all of football, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, during your fantasy championship in Week 17. That's about as lucky as you can get because the guy's been carrying you here for a couple weeks. But unless you're in a deeper league, I'm really not considering Russell Gage. It's basically been Julio Jones or bust here the past couple of weeks. What about Tampa Bay? They got Justin Watson, Brashad Perryman. Atlanta allows over 22 fantasy points per game, and we know Tampa Bay likes to throw the ball. These two combined for 22 targets last week in Week 16. But they started to get Ronald Jones a little bit more involved this past week. He had 17 touches. That's the most he's had in a game since Week 9. Now for Week 17, he's a decent flex option is Ronald Jones. I'm not going to say he's a must start by any means, but he has some upside in the game in which they're going to have to include him once again. Now as for Perryman and Watson, I don't mind them once again this week. I think the upside's going to be there. The volume we know is going to be there. Jameis Winston's going to throw 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions on a weekly basis. It's just going to happen. Devontae Freeman for the Falcons, a very difficult matchup for him going up against Tampa Bay. However, I mentioned it a few seconds ago, it's really been Julio Jones or bust, but next in line's kind of been Devontae Freeman. He's had a strong end of the season here, and they're going to have to include him once again this week. His involvement in the passing game makes him a little bit safer here on a weekly basis. So give me Freeman, give me some Rojo, along with Perryman, Watson, and a little bit of Julio Jones. Eagles and Giants now, and the Philadelphia Eagles continue to win ball games despite having very many offensive weapons. but they really need this win. They want to control their destiny and get into the NFL playoffs. Now, their matchup this week going up against the Giants, who it's easier to throw on than it is to run on. They just played this team 2 weeks ago. In that game, Miles Sanders had 15 carries, only 45 yards, added 4 receptions, but for only 24 yards. But the volume is there, and what are we chasing? That's right, we're chasing volume. Now, over his past 2 games, he's had at least 25 touches in each of those games, a total of 328 yards and 3 touchdowns. Miles Sanders is the lone big playmaker in this offense right now. He's going to remain a start. Greg Ward, if you're in a 14-team league or larger, a PPR-style league, then he becomes a flex option, not somebody I'm really looking at in 10 or 12-team formats. For the Giants, Saquon Barkley. It took him long enough, but he finally decided to show up here, and over his last 2 games, 422 total yards and 4 touchdowns. Thanks for finally showing up at the right time of the year, at least, Saquon Barkley. For the wide receiver position, you got Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, Golden Tate. As of late, Slayton's kind of been the riskier pick. He only has 2 receptions over his last 2 games. I mean, what's going on here? It seems like Golden Tate and Sterling Shepard have kind of taken the lead in that wide receiving group as far as volume goes. They're leading the team in targets there over the past couple weeks, and this is kind of what we're talking about, right? Chasing volume. Are any of them a safe play? No, but they're solid flex options, and personally, I would go with Shepard and Tate over Slayton at this point. I don't know the reasoning behind the lack of volume, but if we're chasing volume, I'm not going to take a risk on somebody who just hasn't been getting it. Titans and Texans up now, and this is a matchup between 2 teams who both want to win this game. They're both playing for something, and it sounds like Derrick Henry is going to be back to close to full health for the Tennessee Titans. Great timing for those of you who own him here in fantasy football. But what about A.J. Brown? He continues to explode also. He's had 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games. He's on the verge of 1,000 yards receiving, but only has 48 receptions. The guy is breaking off huge plays here almost on a weekly basis. Houston, they allow right around 23 fantasy points per game, so A.J. Brown is going to stay back in the lineup once again this week with Derrick Henry. Now for Houston, DeAndre Hopkins killed a lot of people last week. Only 5 catches for 23 yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. What the heck happened there? But Houston needs to win this game to try and improve their playoff seed heading into the NFL playoffs. Now, obviously, you're still going to start DeAndre Hopkins here this week, but Will Fuller, he's out. So that kind of opens the door a little bit for Kenny Stills, who saw 9 targets last week with Fuller leaving early. However, he's just more touchdown dependent in this offense. Not quite a safe play, more of a flex play. For the running game, Tennessee's a middle-of-the-pack run defense. They allow right around 18 fantasy points per game, but Hyde just ran all over this team for 26 carries, 104 yards, and a touchdown just 2 weeks ago. That makes him a solid flex play. Why? Because the volume is there. It's a running back that we know that's going to go out there and touch the ball close to 20 times. That can be a little bit of a rarity here in Week 17. If you got him as a flex play, not a bad play whatsoever. Redskins and Cowboys up now, and the playoff hopes of the Dallas Cowboys are dwindling by the second, it seems like. They need to win this game, but they also need some help along the way. And if you think Washington is just going to move over and let Dallas have this game, you are sorely mistaken. Not going to happen. Adrian Peterson has already come out and said, listen, we're going there to win this game. But Washington's defense does allow 23 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. So Zeke Elliott is obviously a must start, but it's a great matchup for him. The bigger concern for Dallas is Dak Prescott, his shoulder, and how does it affect Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup? Now, Amari Cooper, only 5 catches for 43 yards combined over his last 2 games, and Gallup hasn't found the end zone since week 10. They did combine for 23 targets last week, though, so the volume is still there in a great matchup going up against Washington, so both of them will be starts due to that volume. What about on the Redskins side of things? Adrian Peterson, he's a pretty safe flex play on a weekly basis. 3 straight games with at least 17 touches and 4 straight games with a touchdown. But what about the wide receiving options there for the Washington Redskins? Dallas, they're number 5 in the NFL against opposing wide receivers, giving up right around 19 fantasy points per game. But Terry McLaurin with Case Keenum under center, who will be starting here for the quarterback position of the Washington Redskins, he's a borderline top 10 option on the season. They have produced when they've been together all year long. I'm going to start Terry McLaurin once again this week. The guy's a very underrated rookie that can make some noise with Case Keenum once again this week. Steelers and Ravens up now, and the Ravens are going to be resting a lot of their starters here this week, but this is a must-win game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And yet I still don't like the offense for Pittsburgh here this week. James Conner, not 100% healthy. That running game in Pittsburgh, inefficient at best is I guess how you could put it. You got Duck Hodges back under center. Mason Rudolph will not play in this game. He is out. But I'm not loving Duck Hodges either. I mean, heck, he's got more interceptions than touchdowns over his last 5 games. 4 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. Yeah, they get Juju back, which is great. But then he's also got Deontay Johnson and James Washington. We already know that he cannot support all 3 wide receivers, so who is it going to be? There's going to be very limited big plays in this offense to go around. Deontay Johnson has kind of shown some of that in the past. We've known that Juju could do it here for a couple years, but can we really bank on that this week? No, we cannot. If I had to risk it with just one wide receiver out of this bunch, it would be Juju in hopes that he can spend more time in the slot. And we've kind of seen at times Baltimore be vulnerable from the slot. We saw just a couple weeks ago with Jamison Crowder as an example. Maybe Juju can kind of fit into that role and try to help carry this team to a victory. Because like I said, Pittsburgh has to win this game. Why not try to force feed it to your best wide receiver in Juju? But it's a crapshoot. It's a shot in the dark at best. For the running game, actually for anybody in Baltimore, Gus Edwards is pretty much all I'm going to touch. We know no Mark Ingram. We know no Lamar Jackson. Gus Edwards is somebody who could go out there and get you right around 15 touches. Deeper leagues, Justice Hill is another name that you could pay attention to. He may see some late third, fourth quarter action. You never know if he could break one for a touchdown. In my opinion, though, the volume lies with Gus Edwards. And if you're in desperation at times for a running back, that's who I would be looking at for the Baltimore Ravens. Colts and Jags up now, and this one's pretty easy for the running back position, right? Marlon Mack, Leonard Fournette, both going to be starts here in Week 17, but this is a great matchup for one Marlon Mack going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, who since Week 13 have given up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs out of any other team in the NFL. And Mack basically a lock to go out there and get you close to 15 to 20 touches. Leonard Fournette, he's still seeing consistent pass work, which is giving him that safe floor, and he remains a weekly must start just due to the volume that we know that he's going to see. But what about wide receiver? There really is no safe play here. I mean, you have DJ Chark, who is slowly getting closer and closer to 100% health, and he had 15 targets, 8 receptions, 104 yards, and 2 touchdowns against this same Colts team back in Week 11. Now, Conley, he remains touchdown dependent. He's only had more than 5 receptions in a game twice all year. He's had 6 receptions over his last 2 games. 3 of them were touchdowns. Very, very touchdown dependent, big play dependency for Chris Conley. Does not give me, that safe feeling to start him either. For the Colts, T.Y. Hilton, I mean, can we really trust him at all this year? 7 catches for 51 yards over his last 2 games combined. And it's so much easier to run on Jacksonville that I don't see Indianapolis forcing the ball in the passing game. To me, I'm just going to stick with the running game here and take a chance on DJ Chark if I'm in need for a wide receiver. Raiders and Broncos up now, and as unlikely as it sounds, and probably is, there's still a mathematical chance that the Oakland Raiders can make the playoffs. That's crazy to even think about, considering the season that they've had and all the turmoil that surrounded the Oakland Raiders. But what about this week? What about Josh Jacobs? Does he play? Yeah, he's dealing with that shoulder injury still, but he's also posted on his Instagram here earlier in the week that he underwent a minor leg surgery also just to treat some sort of infection, and they said that it did not limit his status at all for this coming up weekend. But what about the shoulder injury? That's something we're still waiting to find out on. It's going to be one of those things that we really need to wait and see until we get closer to the game. Do they limit him? Maybe a 50-50 split between him and Washington. Maybe he sits altogether and Washington becomes a great start once again here this week. Just something we really need to pay attention to. For the wide receivers of the Oakland Raiders, not really interested in Tyrell Williams. He had a decent game last week, but not somebody who's produced consistently enough here second half of the season for me to trust him. On the Denver side of things, I love Phillip Lindsay last week, and I love him once again this week. The Oakland Raiders allow on average 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and he's only 42 yards away from having yet another 1,000-yard season. But what about the wide receiver side of things? I mean, usually it's just Courtland Sutton that we talk about, and the volume has been there. The production, not so much. But he's had at least 10 targets in 2 straight games. Maybe they want to end the season on a high note. Him and Drew Lock, they go out there against a secondary in the Oakland Raiders who give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, giving up over 25 fantasy points per game. He's more of a low-end wide receiver 2 at this point. For a few weeks there, he was all the way up high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1 because of this volume. But due to the lack of production here as of late, he's dropped down the rankings here a little bit. Still a start, just more of a low-end wide receiver here in Week 17. Cardinals and Rams up now, and boy, did the upset last week of the Arizona Cardinals over the Seattle Seahawks shake things up in the NFC a little bit. Not to mention Kenyon Drake looks like the GOAT running back right now. 330 total yards, 6 touchdowns, and 50 total touches over the last 2 games combined. I mean, we got to ride that hot streak here, keep it going, playing for momentum. Heck, he's probably playing for the organization right now, saying, listen, I can be the lead back here if you want to move on from David Johnson. Can we really trust the passing game in Arizona, though? It's been somewhat non-existent for a few weeks. Kyler Murray, he's limited with a hamstring injury. You have the pass rush of the Los Angeles Rams, and then you also have Jalen Ramsey there on the outside. Does he take Christian Kirk? Does he lock down the outside receiver? Really limits them, on a play-by-play basis. Larry Fitzgerald, he's more touchdown dependent at this point of his career. The volume hasn't really been there, in my opinion. The only Cardinal player that I would risk it with this week would be Kenyon Drake. On the Rams side of things, I mean, Todd Gurley continues to be a little bit on a mission here second half of the season as they were trying to make a playoff push. 6 touchdowns over his last 4 games, but do I expect them to go out there and run Gurley into the ground? No, probably not. They're not really playing for anything this week. They have nothing really to gain by winning this game against the Arizona Cardinals. I still expect, Todd Gurley to go out there and get right around 20 touches, but I don't see them running him into the ground. There is some risk there, but the touchdown upside is so high, he'll remain a start. For wide receivers, Robert Woods continues to catch a lot of balls. He's by far the safest option of this wide receiver trio. 56 targets over his last 5 games. Heck, over the last 4 games, Cooper Kupp has only seen 20 targets. He's more touchdown dependent, but I like this matchup going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Brandon Cooks, more of a deeper league flex at best, just has not shown any consistency here throughout the season. Kenyon Drake, Todd Gurley, Robert Woods, and Cooper Kupp, those are the pieces that I like in this matchup here this week. A huge Sunday night football game, San Francisco 49ers at the Seattle Seahawks, 2 teams that really need and want this victory to improve their playoff seeding heading into the NFL playoffs. Now we know Marshawn Lynch newly signed back to the Seattle Seahawks after the injuries to Chris Carson and CJ Prosise, but does he make an impact here in Week 17? Does Richard Sherman lock down DK Metcalf? I mean, these two faced off in Week 10. DK 6 catches for 70 yards, but did have a fumble in that game also. Which Tyler Lockett shows up? The one that can win you your fantasy matchup all by himself, or the one who just takes Sundays off? Kind of hard to really pinpoint when they're going to really utilize Tyler Lockett going forward. This is going to be a very hard-hitting and exciting game to watch. One that really could be decided on 1 or 2 big plays. If you want a Hail Mary of a play and you are decimated at injuries, that's what Marshawn Lynch becomes a play. In my opinion, I'm not willing to risk it if I have other more solidified options on my bench. If you have nobody else, then he becomes a play. For San Francisco, Raheem Mostert, not quite a must-start Mostert, but he's pretty dang close, is the safest option at this point. 5 straight games with a touchdown and scoring at least 10 fantasy points in each of those games. For wide receiver, Deebo Samuel and Emmanuel Sanders, they bring over their own set of risks. I mean, Deebo, he only has 1 game with over 4 receptions out of his last 5 games played, and Emmanuel Sanders has only 2 games over 60 yards receiving over his last 7 games played. Right now, this offense is a whole lot of Raheem Mostert and George Kittle. If I had to pick another wide receiver, the next safest option really seems to be Deebo Samuel in this offense because he's also getting, carries out of the backfield, which has actually produced some rushing touchdowns here throughout the season. Is he a lock as an absolute must-start? No, he's not. I expect both defenses to really show up in this game, and a lot of these weapons going to be touchdown dependent, and there's a lot of risk involved in this game. None of these guys are surefire must-starts in my opinion. The safest one of the entire group, maybe Raheem Mostert. All right, those are all my starts and sits here for Week 17 fantasy football for the running back and wide receiver position here. And like I said earlier, I understand a lot of people probably don't play Week 17 fantasy football, but we preach community in this channel, trying to make sure we take care of every person that we possibly can. That's why we're making Week 17 videos here. I understand the views will be a lot lower than they were in season, heck, even last week. So if you could do me a favor, hit that like button for me. We would greatly appreciate it. It's been a great year here for Headliner Nation, and we're not stopping. Just because the regular season is over does not mean that you won't see weekly videos on this channel. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. A lot of great things coming up in 2020. Hopefully you had a great Christmas, a happy holiday, a happy new year. Good luck this weekend. Yes, we will still be doing rankings videos also. They'll be coming out here shortly, so make sure you check those out as well. Hopefully everybody has a great rest of your week, a great holiday season, and we'll talk to you later.